I hope that after we've walked through what I'll present, which is strongly connected with diagnosis, the need to access good diagnosis of pests, which will be presented by Julian, we will be clear on whether it is possible in the African context, and if it is possible, what would it require us to do differently? Now, I would want to start, first of all, by giving what I would call an introduction. Now, the concept of pest-free area is something we need to look at in relation to phytosanitary certification. We look at it in relation to phytosanitary certification in the sense that if a produce is coming from an area officially recognized to be pest-free, for that particular pest, that is adequate. So you should not therefore have a situation where it's from a pest-free area and then you are trying to apply other measures unless those are for other pests than the one from a free area. Now, the IPPC has spelled out the context of pest-free area in what I would call 3 levels. Pest-free area in ISPM 4, or pest-free place of production and pest-free production site, the last 2 in ISPM 10. It's good to be clear of what distinguishes these from each other, and more importantly, what does it mean to the national plant protection organizations? What does it mean to the industry actors, particularly the producers, and even other players in the value chains? Now, beginning 2016, when EU notified a new regulation that came into force in December 2019 rather, African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries have had to get into what I would call a reality check, because this regulation has come with very stringent measures. And for some of the regulated pests in the EU, the options are 4, of which 3 apply to pest freedom. Now, we will look at those, and I'm happy that the 4th option, which is effective phytosanitary treatment, had been covered in a previous webinar under ISPM 14. I will try to illustrate pest-free areas, but with examples from the Americas that were obtaining some time back. The situation may have changed. I think the most important thing is to understand the concepts. But this illustration should provoke us into thinking, what would NPPOs, governments, and producers in Africa prepare for? What is feasible? What is not feasible? What can be done to make what is not feasible, feasible? Particularly if you want to access the EU market after the new regulations. So the objectives of my talk are to develop a realistic understanding of the situations where pest-free areas and pest-free places of production can apply in Africa's production system. I know I'm talking to the Southern Africa group. I worded this objective this way because I've seen in East Africa an attempt to communicate that it is possible to establish a pest-free area for oriental fruit fly, Bactrocera dorsalis. And I felt that was the NPPO not communicating honestly with the administration and the industry. The other is that we want to clarify the IPPC context of the 3 and what role this has or expects of the NPPOs and producers, And finally, we really have to reflect on the feasibility, particularly of pest-free area and pest-free place of production, considering the necessary official controls to maintain them. Establishing is one thing, maintaining is another. Remember, for the last bullet, I've left out pest-free production sites because those are, I know, are feasible because I see quite a number of them in several African countries. Now, the practice, if you look at pest-free areas, the practice of establishing this or maintaining this or ensuring this exists also comes with some of its requirements. But what is a pest-free area? It's an area or place of production or production site in which a specific pest is absent. If it is false codling moth, it's absent. Maybe Helicobacter could be there. Maybe Babesia could be there, but if you are targeting it to be free of FCM, it should be absent. And two, it is not just saying it is absent. There must be scientific evidence to show that it is absent. And there is also need to recognize that this absence also is characterized by official maintenance of that condition. Official in the sense that it is enforced through an NPPO action. Official in the sense that NPPO is the organization mandated by law to oversee and be responsible for outcomes of official controls. Now, do we want therefore to say that a pest-free area can be indefinite or it can be for a defined period of time? We will think about that as we move on. But it's good to recognize that for production side, pest-free production side, this could be a place of production where a specific pest does not occur, where a specific pest doesn't occur within an area where the pest is normally present, and that place must therefore be treated as a separate production unit. It can be a screenhouse or a greenhouse in an infested area. I've seen a number of those. Now, what are the distinctions? A pest-free area as a whole is managed by the NPPO of the exporting country. It is usually much larger, sometimes can include several countries or parts of several countries, or it can be just a part of a country, but as a whole, it is larger. And generally, it is maintained over many years without interruption. And its maintenance requires active enforcement of mandatory regulations and active application of mandatory phytosanitary procedures to keep the pest that is not present there from getting there. As opposed to a place of production that can be maintained just for a few growing seasons. Now, a pest-free place of production is managed individually by a producer, but still under the supervision and responsibility of the NPPO. Unlike the pest-free area where the NPPO is maintaining and fully responsible, here the producer also has a hand. And the objectives of both are the same. It's only the ways in which they are implemented that may be different. I say maybe. It could be the same, but they may be different. So a pest-free area can be an entire country. You can find a country. I remember at one time in the Americas, Belize had eradicated a fruit fly, and the entire country was free of the particular fruit fly in question. It also can be an area which is not infested in a country. If the country is infested, an area can be infested and it can be maintained so. It can also be an area within a generally infested area where just a small area is kept free of that pest, and that is more characteristic of a pest-free production site. Now, if you are talking about pest freedom of an area, it's good to think about ecology, not just of the pest, but also of the crop. It's also good to think about what I would call sociocultural production practices, because a number of modifiers affect possibility of having a pest-free area and their maintenance. In terms of the pest, its potential to survive, even where seasons vary, would be important. And if, for instance, a pest occurs somewhere, but it can't survive winter of a particular prolonged period of low temperature, that place can easily be converted to a pest-free area if reinvasion is avoided. If you are on the equator, like where I'm sitting now in Kajiado, it is always summer. That may require, it may be a tall order. Rate of reproduction of the pests, means of its spread or dispersal from place to place, and more importantly, is this pest affecting just one crop or is affecting many? A pest with a wide host range poses a lot of challenge in maintaining a pest-free area. Now, the characteristics of a pest-free area would vary depending on size and its degree of isolation. And if isolation is arising from a physical barrier, that would be a natural God-given phenomenon that would really help already establish such an area, because the aim would be just controlling entry into that area. If it is not, then isolation may still be threatened. Ecological conditions are important both for the pest and for the crop. We know that an area which is highly homogeneous makes certain things easy, but it can also make certain things very difficult, especially if you are dealing with a highly susceptible host plant, a host that is highly preferred by a pest. But of importance is that the level of phytosanitary security of an area is important, because that will determine how the risk of the pest concerned could be handled. Now, the EU brings us to a situation where a number of African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries are to bring this concept of pest freedom to reality. I already talked of Regulation 2016/2031. This was notified in 2016. It came into force in 2019. Over that 3-year period, countries were to adapt or develop systems that would ensure that they meet some of this. It's also good for us as African countries to recognize that the EU is a major trading bloc that, whether we like it or not, we can't just play around with. You either comply and trade and make money, or you don't comply and lose it. EU also tends to be, some of you will disagree, one of the most transparent countries in terms of notifying the risks they take and availing information that can be accessed to know those risks. And this can help you prepare your systems. Now, if we look at the recent changes, adjustments were made that require a lot of monitoring of production places, detecting what is there and identifying them accurately to aid certification, particularly where additional declarations are required in the phytosanitary certificate as a compliance, as a requisite for compliance with the EU conditions. So now, these rigorous rules that have come into force have necessitated monitoring places of production. But apart from that monitoring, being linked with access to dependable diagnostic services, they also allow for certain crop fruits. I think there are only 5 exceptions, that they must only come from a country free of a particular pest, an area free of a particular pest, or a place of production free from a particular pest. But if it is a place of production, there must also be a production site, then there must be a traceability documentation to show what has happened. If it is a site of production that is said to be free, there must be records of monitoring trends or monitoring plans, laboratory tests and what has been confirmed to be absent, and if confirmed to be present, what has been done and what is the consequence of the intervention. Those 3 sub-bullets form the topic of what we are talking about today. The one on effective treatment, there may be many phytosanitary treatments. I think there's an ISPM with so many of these listed. But this also allows the application of integrated measures spelled out in ISPM 14 as one of the areas to arrive at effective treatment. That was a topic for a previous webinar. So what is operational feasibility of a pest-free area or a pest-free place of production in Africa? Now, special requirements on the NPPO. And remember, the NPPO is part of a country. You are not going to say that, let me give an example of Zambia, that this is the PPQS problem. No. It is the Zambian problem. PPQS is acting as officially mandated by Zambia to do it. So these requirements for establishment need that systems are there to establish pest freedom. Phytosanitary measures are being enforced to maintain that freedom as part of the official controls. You can look for the definition of official controls in ISPM 5. There are routine checks to verify that pest freedom is maintained. That is not a walk in the park if you are not adequately resource endowed. And we know that despite a number of our countries, I think this comes even under NEPAD, saying that you really invest a certain percentage of GDP in agriculture, a portion that goes to plant health may be very minimal, or not maybe, is minimal. Carrying out those 3 requires a lot of resources. 2, the methods used to achieve the objectives above also brings us to some of the things we don't like doing. 1, there must be surveys routinely conducted, either delimiting or detection or monitoring. And surveys comes with data collection and analysis. Most of us, even those who are scientists, when you start talking about data and data analysis, things start becoming a bit fishy. Data assembly as evidence that surveys were done is important. And this would require countries to have data platforms that enable access and sharing and use to inform decision. The other is enforcement of official controls, enforcement of mandatory procedures set out by the NPPO, meaning that stakeholders act to adhere. Not a case, I used to work in the NPPO, that I stop your produce in Mombasa, you rush to a high office in the land, then I'm called by phone, can you release it? Then it also requires the NPPO to audit its own systems. so that it identifies, not to punish anybody, identifies areas where things don't work well and corrective measures are put in place. The most important thing for me here is willingness to access laboratory services if you don't have them, and have collaboration with laboratory services such that laboratory turnaround time does not delay your decisions. And if it is your laboratory, you have to resource it. If you are taking it to the UK, where my friend Julian comes from, or the Netherlands, or South Africa, somebody has to pay. This is investment by the countries. Then documentation is critical. Remember, one of the options by the EU is produce from a pest-free place or site of production with traceability. Records must be there to prove that what you say is what you do. You must have reports as evidence of what you did, and work plans to show what you did, where you did it, when you did it, and to help also track what happens. The other thing is that we know general surveillance is normally just scientific search for information. I know NPPOs where if a staff member wants to search for scientific information, that is not important. They should go and inspect. Searching for that information to help write information resource about areas targeted for pest freedom is important, and may involve searching from information from unpublished historical data or contemporary observations. Now, when we talk about contemporary observations, there are cases where industry, producers and exporters are running ahead of NPPOs. They have their scouts, or they call them scouts or quality assurance, quality control officers, who monitor their crops, collect data, but they may also not be willing to share that data with the NPPO. So who is the loser? Initially, it may be NPPO. In the long run, it may be the person refusing to share the data, but ultimately it's the country. 2, surveys must be conducted targeting the pests, and these surveys form part and parcel of maintenance of a pest-free area. If you are talking of establishing a pest-free area, you must have very clear survey plans and protocols in place, and surveys must always be connected with diagnostics. Now, establishing a pest-free area can be simple, but it can also be very complex. The most important thing is that it should assure the trading partners of phytosanitary security of what you export to them. So an operational plan needs to be drawn. Normally, most pest-free areas are recognized bilaterally. I remember way back in 2008, 2007, 2008, IPPC Secretariat tried to develop international mechanism for international recognition of pest-free areas. I don't think it worked. So that plan should list the specific details of activities required in the operation, the roles and responsibilities of both producers, traders, and the NPPO. It's no longer the time where this is a problem of the NPPO. If things fail, we blame them. If things work, we succeed. No. You either win as a team or you all lose. It is good also to have checks for verification of pest freedom. And again, this is very strongly connected with the need to access laboratories with the dependable, I don't want to call it through, quick turnaround time laboratory services, because verification and internal management is important for maintenance of a pest-free area. So as you want to establish a pest-free area, think of how you will maintain it. To maintain it, you will be able to access laboratory services, ad hoc inspections of exported consignment, requirements that researchers and other people notify the NPP of occurrences of any pest they target. When I was a researcher a long time ago, I used to hurry to publish. It's good to publish, it builds your CV, but it's also good that as you publish, that information helps correct a problem. Because you may publish and the NPP may not read that paper over a long period of time. So monitoring surveys must therefore, a framework for maintaining them should be there. The establishment and maintenance of pest-free areas should be adequately documented and periodically reviewed in terms of data, in terms of regulations. If they are not effective and procedures, you need to change. So if you apply a method, you need to focus on what was its outcome. The technical details of surveillance systems used are critical. There are administrative measures taken to protect PFA. Some of them may not be popular with us, but it's just like telling people you can't enter here unless you have a business here. And if you are entering, you must not come with X, Y, Z. If you are leaving, you must not leave with ABC. Then delimitation of a pest-free area, including where necessary, even having a buffer zone. So documentation about PFA may be sent. Normally, it's needed by the trading partner under bilateral arrangement, but it would also be good that you share it with the IPPC Secretariat, or if your RPPO is keen, it's a good practice to share it, because it would help others know that they can source certain products from your country. Now, I talked about whether it's bilateral or international in terms of recognition. Now, the exact situation still, to me, is fluid, because the burden of proof or confirming or convincing people of pest freedom remains a challenge. Some good examples, these are things of early, mid-2000s, they may no longer be obtaining from the Americas and Chile, where there was a situation where there's a medfly infested area, it is clearly identified, then the fruit production is targeted to a place which is medfly free. If it is medfly free through eradication, measures must be taken, because it means it's a favorable environment. Measures must be taken to ensure no movement of what is likely to bring that fruit fly comes from the infested area to the area that has been made free. That means that what I see in my country here of traffic police doing on the road is what the NPPO staff will do. Essentially, you monitor any movement of plant materials and conveyances that are likely to bring the pest to where it is not present. That is not cheap. The other, again, if you look at a situation where you have exports requiring treatment, only those from an infested area would require treatment, assuming there's treatment for that. Those from an area that is free would not require treatment. That should come out clearly. You should not say it is pest-free, then you still subject it to treatment, because treatment also is a cost. But if you want that, then you are not sure. If you must insist on treatment, then you are not sure about the effectiveness of your fruit fly freedom, pest freedom situation. If you look again at the situation in Brazil, again with melon fruit flies, more or less the same. But the most important thing a country that is infested can still export if those exports come from a pest-free area, often with additional requirement that they must come from designated ports. If the port is in the infested area and you produce from an uninfested area, the likelihood of reinfestation may occur. That may also come with special requirements for the NPPOs. There's a case here, again, this is a combination of pest freedom, but you are targeting other pests. So some are free. One pest may be, the produce may be free of one pest, but there are other pests you are targeting at the same time, like maybe your citrus canker may be free, but still you want to target Ceratitis capitata, the medfly, then that can mean combination. But combination becomes necessary only if you are dealing with more than one pest. So what are the key requirements? One, before you think of establishing a pest-free area, you must know that there will be an official ongoing monitoring process. You will need to know that the delimiting surveys will be officially conducted, officially in the sense that NPPO has a hand in it. This will be conducted to establish the boundaries of an area considered to be infested or free from a target pest. Exclusion, so these are phytosanitary measures to prevent the entry of a pest into an area that is free. It's really enforcement. Containment, phytosanitary measures in and around an infested area to prevent spread of the target pest to these areas or places or sites of production that are free. Then eradication is a very difficult thing to do. Unless you can do it when you are creating a site of production under greenhouses. But if you have Bactrocera dorsalis spread throughout Eastern and maybe Southern Africa, there may be effective official controls maybe in South Africa, then you don't have any official controls that would really contain its spread, then eradication becomes unrealistic. So with this long presentation, I hope that we have a very clear picture of what would be expected of us, and knowing what would be feasible. Is it considering production sites first, then later process of production, before we now think of have a vision of ultimately a pest-free area, unless we are preparing to deal with a pest that we know is likely to come, but it's not yet here. Xylella fastidiosa, for instance, if you know the causal agent of Pierce's disease, would affect a lot of plants. It's not here yet. We could decide that as a continent or as a group of countries, it will never come. There is also the brown marmorated stink bug. It's not here yet, but we know perhaps it's on the way, just the way Bactrocera was on the way, and fall armyworm and the like. Then it would require country action, regional action, and continental action. I really wish that one of these days we would have a coordination in Africa of the kind that the EU has that would help us to decisively pick what is feasible and decide when to deploy.
So my name is Julian Smith. I'm from Rothamsted Research in the UK, but previously CABI and Ferrer Science Limited. So basically, I've had experience in Africa, but also moved to focus from the UK side of plant health, working with Ferrer. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today. And my talk's focused on the pest diagnostics and surveillance side, or really the functioning of an NPPO in terms of its that sort of capacity to identify and monitor pests in the environment. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today. I'm always privileged to have the opportunity to talk on subjects like this for people in Africa, based on being in the UK. And one of the outcomes, I hope, is that we can improve the plant health capability of the globe as an outcome of the types of work that CABI and FAO pioneer. My talk's on 3 areas, and it's sort of based from experience from CABI and FAO and Rothamsted. I'm going to talk about plant health and something which is relatively new to plant health: national laboratory status, national reference laboratory status. So this is something we could think a bit more about in the future for Africa. Then how we achieved and demonstrate capacity and what that looks like. And then a third area, just a quick brief on ISP 35 as a sort of adage to the excellent talk that Washington gave on the ISPMs for low prevalence and pest-free areas, etc. And that would probably link well with the third speaker today on an example of the private sector. So to be keep to time, hopefully, I think one of the things I'd really want to say is that from the UK sense, we have a plant, and the European sense, our biosecurity strategy has increasingly recognized that pest risk is a continuum, and that starts in the sites of production. And this probably is where the new regulations that Washington talked to originate from, in that we can have the best border inspectors in the world and invest huge amounts of finance and resource into that. But ultimately, we will only be as effective as we can be at that. And it'll be much better to prevent the pest from getting on the plane or the ship, so that that border inspection can be reduced. And so that's the aim here. And I think when we think about pest-free areas and the sort of transitions that we're trying to talk about here, is that if we focus just on creating pest-free areas and low prevalence areas and site-free production in a vacuum of the MPPO being overall effective in its mandate for biosecurity, then we will fail. So we mustn't lose sight of that bigger picture of what national biosecurity is: the preparedness, the capacity, and the response. So an MPPO plays a huge role in Africa and is critical to the private sector and trade. And ultimately, what we want to talk about when we talk about trade is trust. It's an MPPO talking to another PPO, engaging with the private sector and agreeing what is effectively a contract as how trade will flow, and then to deliver on that contract as builds trust in the delivery. There's no shortcuts around the impact this new regulations will have on trade direction. There will be examples where we cannot control pests in the environment to create a pest-free area. And in those situations, the only way in which production will happen is, and export will happen, is if those situations morph to examples of pest sites of production or pest production sites. And that might be indoors under glasshouse or screenhouse. And we've seen that in pepper in Kenya and examples like that. So those are major impacts of the regulation. But in time, the private sector will win through in this, and trade will equivalate into a better situation and a safer trade environment. And one of the key points here is that a pest in itself, a plant pest, is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not inherently the problem. A well-managed pest can drive private sector advantage, and it will differentiate between those that can implement good measures and management and those that can't. So, a well-managed pest is actually the differentiator of trade and can create economic wealth. So, a country that manages its pests well will do better than another country that doesn't. So, at various scales, you can think of how this new legislation can motivate new trade and better trade. I can move down. Sorry. I'm just not being able to move the page. Oh, there we go. So So first of all, this designation of a plant health national reference laboratory status. In food safety, this is of common occurrence. It's well established. You have reference laboratories for mycotoxins, pesticide residues, veterinary drugs, heavy metals, etc. FERA is the reference laboratory in food safety for many of those things for the EU when it was part of the EU, and now as for the UK. But in plant health, that status hasn't been well recognized or hasn't been used. And it's only now being sort of implemented across Europe, where you've got various laboratories that are taking on national reference laboratory status for distinct pests and diseases. The UK is not part of that because we're not part of the EU anymore. But for the UK, FERA Science Limited is the UK National Reference Laboratory for England. And it's a very interesting concept, and it's one that we had a discussion with Kefis on a couple of years ago before COVID sort of prevented a lot of the discussions that we now resorting to Zoom. Because, you know, we're very free with our words and how we talk about centers of excellence. And, you know, everyone's keen on a center of excellence when it's their institute that is the center of excellence. And everyone will be keen on the national reference laboratory status or when it's them that is with that designation. And the NPPO is the National Reference Laboratory. It's within the NPPO's gift to designate which laboratory is its National Reference Laboratory. That might be in-house or it might be outsourced. So we had a discussion with Kefis as to what the roles, what was meant by an NRL, and what could be embodied by it. So when we said it, and FERA said it, and Kefis said it, we said it with the same types of understanding on, you know, the regulations, the infrastructure, and how we engage with other partners. And this is the summary of a week's discussion where we came up with a sort of a overview of what the national reference laboratory status was meaning for Kefis and for FERA. You know, it's around to enhance the biosecurity function of plant health diagnostics through provision and maintenance of culture collections, reference materials, and diagnostic protocols and training. So those are the types of delivery things that we felt were important. You know, we were recognizing key values of collaboration, scientific excellence, creativity, transparency, accountability, integrity, reliability, and efficiency. And we're delivering on services and culture collections, training protocols and competence, behavior, and ethics. So these were the sort of key attributes that we thought embodied what a national reference laboratory status should be. And in how we operate to secure pest-free areas and the surveillance and the monitoring and auditing around that, these are the same values that we have to apply into that arena. So moving on to plant pest diagnostic capacity. My default here is to think about PCR machines and validation of diagnostics for the detection of a pest or disease. But, you know, our record here is that we develop a lot of diagnostics that never get used and never get applied appropriately. You know, very rarely are pest diagnostics integrated into our surveillance and pest systems effectively. One of the exceptions here is with maize lethal necrosis, where we were involved in the early characterization of that disease and developed PCR primers, real-time primers that were then introduced into the certification scheme for that disease in Kenya, at least. And that was, you know, the certification scheme took that diagnostic into its system and it was integrated to it. The advantage being that there was a large private sector to afford the costs of that certification scheme. So the key things about diagnostics is that it has to be sufficient in scope. You know, the NPPO has to have a range of diagnostics that can work for what it was required to do. I mean, each pest and each crop presents a different challenge, as Washington was demonstrating in his talk. You know, each country is different. Within each country, areas are different. So everything is on a case-by-case basis, and it's no one shoe will fit all here. So everything has to be nuanced to the delivery of the commodity and the environment you're working with. And that's why I go back to the idea that this is a contract with the NPPOs involved. And that's a discussion that has to be had. You know, it can be overwhelming to look at all those ISPMs because they're written in a very forthright way which doesn't give the impression that there's much of a negotiation here or a discussion to be had, but it's definitely a discussion between the MPPOs as to what's workable and achievable and what's realistic. Border ports in the EU will still monitor for pests and diseases coming from Africa, Kenya, Morocco, South America, South Africa, all those countries. They will still do the border inspections even when the pest-free status is achieved, pest-free productions are audited, etc. None of that is going away. So this is just a risk-proofing around existing systems. So what's really key in terms of your diagnostic capacity is that you can demonstrate the quality of the service that you're doing. And it has to be affordable and sustainable. And I think that point is probably one of the questions raised in the discussion as to how do MPPOs achieve what is a very steep task to create or demonstrate pest-free areas in a way when resources are always scarce. So in the UK, in Europe, resources are scarce too. There's very few people, very, very few examples where we actively have people out surveying, taking samples, testing for pests and diseases. Most of what we do in terms of surveillance and monitoring is embedded in the private sector process and the monitoring of those supply chain lines, be them seeds or imports, exports, etc. We don't go in a research mode to determine the prevalence of X, Y, or Z, unless it's exceptional cases. So for those things that are endemic, we wouldn't do that. For an outbreak, we would put special measures in place to monitor for that. UK is now outside of the EU, so we are also looking at the question of pest-free areas for our production into Europe. It's something that might come our way in time. So these things are all very relevant to us. Some of the pictures there, the top right one is a proficiency testing kit. So by proficiency testing, this is a diagnostic kit which demonstrates which laboratories can take to validate the effectiveness of their PCR protocol. So we developed this for cassava brown streak under some Gates funding under the Great Lakes Cassava Initiative. And many other laboratories in East Africa and America and the UK who are researchers tried this test to demonstrate how their methods were working. So this is an example of the demonstration of how competent your laboratory is. And that quality assurance is really key to demonstrate if you're going to have trust with your partner. You need to think through how your laboratory works. This was an FAO workshop or an FAO guide that Farah and myself led on with partners in New Zealand. It's a very lengthy document on diagnostic services. The workflow or the picture to the left demonstrates the type of inputs that we think are important to a national laboratory in terms of operational basis, hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, human capacity and resources. It's useful to think about those things as you measure the capability you have in your country. Then you've got the idea that the workflow, how the sample comes in, how you receive, diagnose, report, etc. on that workflow, and the outcomes that are associated with each of those stages so that you have this sort of transparency in delivery. So that's one resource that you might look at as to the diagnostic capacity that you have in your situation. It's quite a complicated book, and it's probably at the top end of what you would require. So it's sort of a state-of-the-art situation. The other side of this is that we don't all need to be leading centers for plant health capability. What we need to have is a minimum capability that serves the needs in front of us. And under another FAO project, we worked with NEPO which was looking at biosecurity in the northeast countries or the northern countries of Africa. We started to think about what would be a minimal capacity for a country, an MPPO, to have that enabled it to deliver most of its services. So this is just a quick overview of some of the things that you might consider as your functions. You list them down and you think about to what extent you are able to do them or not, and how you might achieve that. So you can bring things in-house. So you can have your own laboratory, your own PRA capability, your own sort of databases, digital tools, etc. Or you can outsource some of these things, not all of them, but some of them you can outsource on. And this is an interesting question for people, because we can't all be centers of excellence. We can't all have everything. And there's an argument that some of the pest identification and services these days can be provided more quickly by other laboratories, maybe outside of the country than in the country, and actually more affordable. But if you do that, if you think that you'll use, by example, CABI's identification service, which is extremely good, extremely timely, etc., you must have the contract in place with CABI to enable you to do that service quickly, so that there's no delays around that sort of administration, so that you can be timely. So you have to think through how you'd get those services. So make or buy is a really interesting concept. And just to emphasize that point, one of the discussions we had with a country in the Middle East, which was trying to counter the risk of tomato brown rugosa fruit virus, was how they would build that capacity in a country which has next to no plant health capacity. So you can have all various different areas of excellence. So you can have the pest risk analysis in the MPPO, or you can outsource that. You can outsource everything pretty much, other than perhaps the implementation that's on the ground. So even the management and regulations, you can have that outsourced to in terms of its design. All the diagnostics you can outsource. The pest risk analysis you can outsource. So you could have a very minimal in a country level capability, but with maximum outsourcing. And that's a very viable model if it's well funded. Or you have the alternative where you try to create a really excellent capability with an advanced diagnostic capacity, with broad capability as there. And this is just a diagram to sort of suggest what state of the art could be in terms of the laboratory that was able to provide diagnostic services. The sampling should never be undervalued in terms of the effort that's required. Of this diagram, the middle bit, where all the technical governance of the laboratory is in terms of the management system, the quality systems over there, is substantial to do. And this is a sort of state of the art. This is a all singing, all dancing laboratory. But actually, the hardest part of this diagram is getting the sampling coming into the laboratory, because that's where the cost is and the time in travel. And that's where you need to work mostly with the private sector, such that they become part of the service that you try to create, so that samples are coming from them, and the audit from that is then important. So here, the knack would be to maximize the service breadth with the minimum amount of infrastructure and human resource. And that's a key driver for laboratories anywhere, I would argue, and an opportunity for countries where the laboratory capability currently isn't strong. It's much harder to transform an existing capability into a new capability. But if you can start roughly afresh, then this is what you should aim for. So as I've sort of alluded to, surveillance has to be a partnership. And I think this is where the surveillance bit comes in. The private sector is very much the client here for the MPPO. It has to be brought into the discussion as to how they're going to demonstrate pest-free status in production. Maybe not at pest-free areas, it's less of a concern, but I would still argue that pest-free sites of production are going to become the predominant export norm. Pest-free areas, proving a negative is very difficult. Pest country lists tend not to be great, so you have to work hard on that. So these are the sort of things that you have to work through with the contracts that Washington alluded to in terms of the audits and the monitoring and the surveillance protocols you put in place. There's lots of technology out there which can be useful. There's pheromone traps that can be digitized in terms of taking pictures and automating images through to desks in the UK or Australia or UK or wherever. There's physical surveys that you can walk and do, you cut fruit to look for insects within the fruit. There's fly traps, all levels of sophistication. You can do spore monitoring by suction traps linked to PCR. The diagnostics is all there to be used. It comes with a cost, and you have to think about what's scalable and affordable. And my argument here is that I don't think that the MPPOs can scale. So if you look at seed certification, I don't think it's the job for the MPPOs to scale to support all that a country needs. I don't think that's realistic. So if you look at seed certification, the inspection capability of MPOs is a major constraint to the seed sector in Africa. It's just not sufficient to support a growing seed sector. So countries are now looking to privatize the seed inspection service. And that has to be carefully done because there's a fine line between oversight of the MPPO and its independence on the seed certification and pushing the audit back onto the seed certification into the hands of the private sector, which have vested interests. But many countries are taking that as the way to scale seed certification, third-party seed certification. So digital tools such as available with Seed Assure and other types of online platforms that enable real-time monitoring of certification processes that immediately communicate back to the national laboratories as to what's happening in the fields and whether samples need to be taken for diagnostics or other purposes is the way to go. And those things are already happening. And that again needs to be a partnership between the MPPO and the private sector. A key rule here is to take data points once, monitor, record data once, and share data. Farmers in the private sector will soon become disenfranchised if they're having to fill in multiple forms. The last point is that non-research is much of what we do here is not a research question. It's about doing. And I think we need to make sure that we recognize that this is practice and process, not research. And I'll allude to why that's important in the next slide, or in the final slide. So the embedded state here is to embed surveillance in the private sector as a partnership with the MPPOs. And you see good examples of that in Kenya with AAB and how CABI is working with them. So this is the sort of final slide, and it's very brief to give time to my colleagues. ISPM 35 is an interesting ISPM, and I would encourage people to look at this just for background reading, because it gives the framework upon which the other ISPMs in pest-free status and surveillance neatly sits. So it's a systems approach. The ISPM 35 is on fruit fly, so it's not generic. It's specific to fruit fly, and as I say, every case is different. But it goes through a nice list of how you sort of think about the process of pest management. And pest management and surveillance is part of pest management. The biology of the pest, the conduciveness of the buffer environment and the production zone. How efficient are our traps and our traps for surveillance? So what levels of detection can we reasonably achieve? What's the baseline that we're starting with, and which we can report against? And alongside the procedures for surveillance, documentation, and maintenance of status, corrective procedures, as Washington alluded to, are all key components to pest-free management areas and how you evidence them. And yes, the last point there, case by case, each situation will be different. Fundamental basis is to agree practice with the MPPOs such that it's a contract, and to build trust in how you deliver on those services. To finish with just some reflections as to what we can do better and need to focus on. So I think PRAs are the fundamental block here. We need to have pest risk analysis at the forefront of what we're doing here. I get the sense that Africa feels that this is being done to Africa, this pest surveillance and pest-free areas, and it is, but equally, African MPPOs should be thinking about the extent to which they're asking other countries that export into Africa to follow these same principles that the EU have set out with their new regulations, because they're well meant, they're well intended, they're not punitive. It's around creating a better trading situation, and Africa should be looking to implement similar thinking in its trade or its imports from other countries, including the EU, where those come in. It's fair game to have that conversation. So there's better mutual recognition. EFSA in the EU, in the UK, the European Food Safety Authority, takes on plant health and does the risk analysis for the EU or European Union. And it's a really effective body, and it enables the EU to have a single voice on plant health and food safety issues. Africa doesn't have an equivalent to the extent of EFSA, and I think that would be a really good thing to think about, how the MPPOs can come together in plant health to talk as one into the EU and a similar body. I know there's the Inter-African Plant Phytosanitary Association, and that, the RPPO, and that should form that should be, can take that role. But I think to formalize that dialogue would be really good. I think we could all think about how national reference laboratory status could be applied to our country, and what a minimum standard of competency could be demonstrated and achieved for. So to look at that Morocco model, where we did a very brief biosecurity tool that enabled us to measure the minimal capability that country would require to be proficient as an MPPO, would be well worth it. And to better engage with the private sector in areas of seed certification, trade, and biosecurity, and surveillance for pests. And then the last two, MPOs greater access to capacity funding. I think that's, I'm speaking to a converted audience there. MPPOs have been outside the mainstream of donor funding on a basis that research and development excluded MPPOs because they're not research entities. And all the CGAR and all the Gates money tends to go against research questions and therefore into the research organizations and not the MPPOs. That has to change. And the FAO is a very strong voice for that, as is CABI. And the last one is, I would think that we need a biosecurity fund, research fund. So research is important, but we've virtually never, as far as I can recall, had a bespoke fund for a research fund for biosecurity in Africa. We have a problem in that biosecurity, good biosecurity results in something not happening. And that's really hard to demonstrate and hard to win an argument as to why it should be funded. But it's the cornerstone of all successful agricultural countries, is that biosecurity is number one. And I think that's a key point that we should focus on for Africa.
Right, so I'm going to share a few points, and I think it is important to understand that we don't live in a perfect world, and to do things theoretically through the ISPM sounds very good and nice, but if you get to practice, it's not that easy. I'm just trying to get this thing to go on. It seems it's not moving today. There it is. Okay, so we've dealt with this, but basically in this diagram, I'm just going to follow that again. You will have on the one hand a big free area with a small area which is infested by a pest, and possibly with a buffer zone that you can regulate, or else, and that is typically when you have a new introduction in an area, then you can contain, and if you can contain it, then it would be small. Sometimes you have a general big area which is infested or infected by a pest, but you want to exclude or seclude some of that area for trade, and then you actively have to develop a pest-free area, or else that pest-free area is within a natural barrier, and you can do that. So and then I'm just picking up on a few things that is really, really important. And what we've realized is for a pest, let's talk about oriental fruit fly. And the one thing is, since it came to South Africa in 2010, one of the most critical systems that had to be in place is a proper surveillance system. It's always the proof of a pudding, and then you have to have diagnostics to confirm it. So what is the reasons for that? So in 2006, we already started with a nationwide program to survey for Oriental fruit fly. Why did we do that? Because we knew of the outbreaks in Africa since 2003. So we did horizon scanning continuously to see and how this pest is spreading throughout Africa. And that helped us to prepare for a national surveillance program, which we started in 2006. And then thereafter, we've also improved on our legislation, and I'll get to that right now. And when the pest came into the country, it was ready. We could demarcate the area where it was actively infesting the area, where it is establishing, and we could eradicate some areas where it is not establishing. And that is a process that is continuing till today. We have some areas which are mostly in the northern and eastern parts of the country where it is established. There the pest is suppressed, it's under legislation, it's still under quarantine. Then we have areas such as Western Cape where it is free from this pest. We constantly monitor it, we constantly look at areas. When there's an outbreak, we implement corrective actions and we declare it again. Another important point, I didn't mention it on the slide, is that notification is crucial. Country notification of a status remains important. Another pest-free area, which I just want to mention quickly, is citrus black spot. Again, you can see the northern and eastern parts is for orange area. That is where it occurs. It doesn't occur in that whole area because it only occurs in citrus production blocks. But then the green areas where it does not occur. And this is still also actively regulated through legislation as well. And this is very important specifically for our export programs to several countries. This is just the fruit fly area, just to give you an idea. This is an old map. We do need to update it, but the status is more or less still the same. So you can see the red areas, it's where it is established in high numbers. The orange area is where it is occurring in low numbers, it's more seasonal. And then the yellow areas is where you get sometimes outbreaks, which we eradicate from time to time. The green areas is where we don't find the pest. And then you can see there's two yellow dots at the bottom of the screen near Cape Town. Those areas where we got 3 flies detected. There was an eradication program. It's eradicated, and then until today it has not been detected again in the Western Cape. Right. So and I've talked about different components, and this is in the ISPMs, but what is important for me is that you look at phytosanitary measures. Many countries don't implement this, and this is a crucial mistake. Is as soon as a pest gets into the country, you have to put some measures in place in your legislation to regulate it, because you would not necessarily know whether or not a pest-free area or an area of low pest prevalence needs to be, or an area or a pest-free place or site needs to be established. And you have to maintain that status-free legislation. So South Africa has done is, even before Oriental fruit fly came into the country, this pest was already regarded as a quarantine pest. When it came out, national legislation was implemented immediately. And still to today, whenever there's a change in status, if a legislation is amended accordingly, and that is implemented. The same with citrus greening. So in terms of establishment, it's been said a lot, but we have to look at how the pest reacts, its biology, etc. And you also have to look at some of the generics of the area. How can you isolate the area? How can you protect the area? What is feasible, etc. A lot has been said about that. And then phytosanitary security is important. So I'm not going to sit with that. So this is typically what happens after an outbreak in an area. The area needs to be demarcated. So this is what we did. You could see a river there. The river is the Limpopo River, and the northern side of the river is Zimbabwe. south of the river is South Africa. And it is sometimes the dilemma when you have an outbreak of a pest. The red dot is a detection many years ago of oriental fruit fly. Back then it was still Bactrossera invadens. And we had a detection there, and we demarcated an area which we implemented strict phytosanitary control, and thereafter eradication was started. Soon after that, the year after that, it was detected again and again and again. So there was always an influx of new specimens into the area. Later on, this area has been declared as an area which is established. What is important, what I want to show here is, you see the green on the screen. So that green is production areas. The more brown area is natural vegetation. And that is an area where there's a very low rainfall, although it's not an arid area. And so the vegetation is less fruity. So you get less plant types which are carrying fruit, which may be host for oriental fruit fly. However, all along the river, there's plenty of host fruit and other production sites of other crops. In this case, it was tomatoes and peppers and citrus. So all of those were then placed under quarantine. So this is important to evaluate the area, and you could see the purple dots, and those are all the areas which the limiting surveillance traps were placed. And we focused them or concentrated them in the areas where there may be more host plants available. Then public awareness is probably the most important part for establishing a pest-free area. You have to have buy-in from your local areas. In this case, it's a fruit fly pest-free area. Again, back to the fruit flies, ISPM 26, incredibly important. ISPM, a very, very detailed ISPM. I think is one of the most detailed ISPMs with its annexures in the set of ISPMs available. So you have to look at traveling to, through, and from areas where there's a quarantine area, and a quarantine area would then be a pest-free area in this case also. Signpost is very important. You have to have areas where you put in awareness to the public that they are in a quarantine area, and they may not remove fruit without a permit from the area. The one part which we are still struggling to establish, but we handle it in a different way, is fruit inspection stops. This is an Australian example where if you leave a pest-free area, there's a stop where you get physically checked. This is a very difficult roadblock system to put in Africa is quite difficult. What we do in our case, we check the destination points. So we found a way into that. So whenever the fruit is then delivered at distribution centers, shopping centers, fruit, fresh produce markets, there's checks that's put in place so that we can check compliance. Obviously, the casual fruit is the risk which may slip through. Then just to add to that, what is very important, it's also mentioned already, is the additional guidelines in other IPPC. There's also a guide on establishing pest-free areas, which evidently also deals with pest-free places of production and sites. And you can see there where to find it, but there's also a lot of other guides, also the surveillance guide, the diagnostics guides has been mentioned before. And those all helps us to with a little bit more detail to get to the practicalities of our process. This is just my contacts, and I'm sure that you can share that. And then surveillance, as I said, is a constant. This is a case of surveillance in KwaZulu-Natal province for banana bunchy top virus, which is a very important virus. And those community projects, this is into villages, it's backyard gardens, it's not commercial. So these are the places we often have to intervene and see how we can develop control measures. Thank you.